The rain didn't just fall at St. Jude's, it hammered, a relentless, rhythmic assault against the stained glass that felt like a warning. Inside, the air was thick, not just with the scent of lilies and old incense, but with the suffocating weight of expectation. The silence wasn't one of reverence, it was the predatory silence of a room full of people waiting for a carcass to be picked clean. Eleanor Vance sat in the front pew, her black veil a shroud of silk that hid the cold, calculating clarity in her eyes. She could feel the heat of the stairs, the elite of the city, the vultures in designer black, all watching the casket, all watching her. They weren't mourning Arthur, they were measuring the size of his shadow. Then, the heavy oak doors didn't just open, they slammed against the stone walls with a violent, echoing thud that cut through the prayer like a blade. Mr. Sterling, the family lawyer, marched down the aisle. He wasn't carrying a prayer book. He was clutching a cream-colored envelope, sealed with a thick, blood-red wax. The room went ice-cold. Even the rain seemed to freeze against the glass. Mr. Sterling whispered, his voice sharp and urgent. "Mrs. Vance? Forgive the intrusion, but there is a matter of the estate that cannot wait until the reception." A sharp, collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Eleanor didn't move. She kept her eyes fixed on the polished mahogany of the casket, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white beneath her lace gloves. She could feel Julian, her son, sitting just 2 seats away. He wasn't mourning. She could hear it in the cadence of his breathing, it was too steady, too rhythmic, the breath of a man who had just won a long-awaited race. He wasn't looking at the casket, he was looking at the exits to the estate, the exits to the bank. To Julian, her husband's death wasn't a tragedy, it was a massive, liquid asset waiting to be distributed. He leaned closer to her, his shoulder brushing hers, his voice a low, impatient hiss that smelled of expensive bourbon and arrogance. Julian hissed, "Mother, stop this. Don't make a scene in front of the board members. Let the man finish his business. We'll deal with Sterling at the house, where we can actually talk about the transition." Eleanor felt a flicker of something. Not sadness. Not even anger. It was a cold, sharp clarity, like ice forming on a lake. She looked at her son. His jaw was set, his eyes scanning the room not for mourners, but for witnesses to his new authority. He thought she was broken. He thought the grief had turned her mind to ash, leaving her a hollow shell to be managed and eventually disposed of. He had no idea that Eleanor had been watching him for years. She had seen the way he looked at the ledgers when he thought no one was looking. She had heard the late-night, frantic phone calls to offshore accounts. She knew the predator was in the room. And she knew exactly what was inside that envelope. She knew that the time for mourning was over, and the time for reckoning had begun. Eleanor let out a slow, deliberate exhale. The reception was a masterclass in hypocrisy. The air in the grand hall smelled of expensive lilies, heavy perfume, and the metallic tang of unbridled greed. Guests drifted through the room like ghosts in designer black, their condolences sounding like rehearsed lines from a bad play. They spoke in hushed, performative tones about Arthur's legacy, while their eyes drifted to the gold-leafed ceilings and the priceless tapestries. Julian was in his element. He moved through the crowd with a practiced, grieving grace, shaking hands with a firm, proprietary grip. He was already selling the future before the body was even cold, making promises to investors and nodding to creditors as if he already held the keys to the kingdom. He was a man performing a role, and he was playing it with terrifying efficiency. Julian shouted, with a booming, false tone. Arthur was a titan. A man of vision. We will honor that vision by ensuring the estate remains stable. We will not let his hard work be squandered. Eleanor stood by the tall, rain-streaked windows, watching the storm lash against the glass. She felt like a ghost in her own home, a relic of a past that was being rapidly dismantled. She watched Martha, the housekeeper, moving silently through the crowd. Martha was a shadow, a woman who had spent 20 years absorbing the family's secrets like a sponge. She had seen the bruises on Arthur's spirit, and she had seen the rot in Julian's heart. Martha caught Eleanor's eye for a split second. There was no pity in Martha's gaze. Only a strange, quiet recognition. As if they were both standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for the wind to push them over. The tension in the room was palpable, a coiled spring of social maneuvering and hidden agendas. Suddenly, a crystal glass shattered on the floor. The crash silenced the room instantly. In the sudden, vacuum-like quiet, Julian's voice rose, cutting through the tension like a serrated blade. He didn't even look at the broken glass, his eyes were already searching for his next target. Julian didn't care who was listening. He didn't just approach Eleanor, he invaded her space, his shadow looming over her like a threat. The guests began to turn, their faces illuminated by the dim chandeliers, their eyes widening. The social vultures were leaning in, sensing the scent of blood in the water. They weren't here to comfort, they were here to witness a fall. They were the architects of social ruin, and they were ready to build. Julian spoke, his voice cold and dismissive. "Mother, enough of this. Look at you. You're trembling. You're making a spectacle of yourself, and frankly, it's embarrassing for the family." Eleanor kept her face a mask of stone. She didn't let the tremor in her hands show, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. But Julian wasn't finished. He wanted more than just silence, he wanted total dominance. He wanted the room to know that the old guard was dead and he was the new master. He wanted to erase her presence entirely. He shouted, projecting his voice for everyone to hear. "We all know you haven't been yourself since the diagnosis. You're fragile, Eleanor. Unstable. You've become a liability to the Vance name. For the sake of the estate and your own protection, I'll be taking over the management of the trust immediately. It's for the best." A collective gasp rippled through the room, sharp and stinging. The humiliation was surgical. He had stripped her of her dignity, her sanity, and her agency in front of the very people she had spent 30 years trying to impress. He had called her mentally unfit in a room full of her peers, effectively declaring her a non-person. Eleanor felt the heat rise in her cheeks, a burning shame that felt like fire. She felt the eyes of the socialites, the women she had hosted, the men she had dined with, all judging her, all waiting for her to break, to cry, to scream, to prove him right. There was a long, heavy, suffocating silence. Only the sound of Eleanor's slow, controlled, shallow breathing. The silence was broken not by a sob, but by the sharp, authoritative sound of Mr. Sterling clearing his throat. He stepped forward, the cream-colored envelope held firmly in his hand. The room froze. Even Julian stepped back, a flicker of confusion and irritation crossing his face. He thought this was a delay, a nuisance to be brushed aside, a minor hiccup in his coronation. Mr. Sterling spoke, his voice formal and steady. "If I may. There is a final codicil to Arthur Vance's will. It was executed privately, 3 weeks ago, in the presence of 2 witnesses and a notary. It supersedes all previous instructions regarding the primary estate and the Vance holdings." Julian laughed. It was a short, nervous, jagged sound. He thought it was a joke, a mistake, a desperate attempt by the staff to maintain relevance in a world that had already moved on without them. Julian sneered. "Sterling, don't be ridiculous. We've already gone through the probate. The trust is settled. There is nothing left to reveal." Sterling didn't look at him. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at her for a long, searching moment, acknowledging the silent pact between them, the shared secret that had been brewing in the shadows. Then, he broke the red wax seal. The sound was like a gunshot in the quiet room. He pulled out not just the codicil, but a small, handwritten letter on heavy stationery, signed with Arthur's unmistakable, shaky hand. He began to read. His voice was a calm, steady monotone that cut through the room like a scalpel, dissecting the lies that had been told. He read, "To my son, Julian, I leave my watches and my cars. May they serve him as well as his ambition has served him. To my wife, Eleanor, I leave my love and my memories. But to the one person who truly saw me in my final hours. To Martha, my housekeeper. I leave the entirety of the Vance estate, including the manor, the grounds, and all liquid holdings. The world seemed to tilt. The room didn't just go quiet, it went dead. Julian's face turned a sickly, pale gray, the color of ash. The guests stared, mouths agape, their social masks slipping to reveal pure, unadulterated shock. The hierarchy of the room had been obliterated in a single paragraph. And in the corner, Martha. Martha simply stood there, her eyes wide, her hands trembling against her apron. A crystal glass fell and shattered violently on the floor. Julian exploded. He didn't just yell, he lunged toward the lawyer, his face contorted with a primal, unhinged rage. He screamed about fraud, about madness, about the incompetence of the staff. He turned on Martha, his voice a venomous, guttural snarl, accusing her of poisoning his father's mind, of stealing his birthright. He was a man losing his grip on the world, and he was clawing at anyone nearby to stay afloat. He was a cornered animal, and his teeth were bared at the very people who had once feared him. Julian screamed. It's a lie. She's a thief. She's been stealing from him for years. Mother, tell them. Tell them this is a mistake. Tell them you'll fix it. But Eleanor didn't move. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she did something far more terrifying. She smiled. It was a small, razor-thin smile that didn't reach her eyes, a smile of absolute, chilling victory. She stepped forward, moving through the crowd with a grace that was suddenly, terrifyingly purposeful. She stood beside Martha, and for the first time in decades, she didn't look like a victim or a widow. She looked like a queen who had just reclaimed her throne. The room fell into a vacuum of silence as she approached. Eleanor spoke, her voice calm and commanding. Be quiet, Julian. You are making a scene, and you are making yourself look even more pathetic than you already are. And you are quite right about one thing. It is a mistake. A mistake to think that I was unaware of your little games. The room went silent again, a heavy, expectant hush. Even Julian froze, his mouth hanging open, his chest heaving. Eleanor looked him dead in the eye, her gaze piercing through his facade, stripping away the layers of his arrogance until only the coward remained. She said, I watched him sign it, Julian. I sat in the study while the ink was still wet. I held his hand while he dictated those very words. I watched him realize, in his final, lucid moments, that his own son was nothing more than a predator in a tailored suit. I didn't stop him. I didn't warn him. I encouraged him. A collective, stunned, and horrified gasp went through the crowd. The fallout was swift, merciless, and absolute. By the first light of dawn, the legal reality had settled like dust over the ruins of a kingdom. The Vance dynasty, built on generations of calculated greed and a carefully curated reputation, had collapsed in a single, explosive night. Julian was stripped of everything. He was left with nothing but the watches and the cars he had so desperately craved, objects of status that now felt like heavy, useless weights. He was a man without a country, a man without a home, a man whose name was now a synonym for disgrace. The socialites who had once bowed to him, the ones who had whispered his praises, now turned their backs with a practiced, icy efficiency, treating him like a contagion. He was a man who had tried to steal a throne and ended up in the gutter. I whispered, he was a ghost in his own life, haunting the edges of a world that no longer had a place for him. Martha, the woman they had all treated as part of the furniture, was now the mistress of the house. She moved through the grand, silent halls with a quiet, dignified grace, finally given the respect and the authority she had earned through decades of silent, invisible service. She was the new foundation of the Vance legacy. And Eleanor? Eleanor had made her own arrangement. She had not been left with the house, nor the title, nor the burden of the Vance name. She had been left with something far more valuable, her freedom. She had negotiated a settlement that ensured her comfort, but more importantly, she had ensured that the truth was the only thing left standing in the Vance halls. She had burned the bridge to her old life, and she had done so with a steady hand. The sound of a single, heavy brass key turning in a lock echoed through the empty hall. The house was no longer a fortress of wealth. It was a monument to a man's final, desperate act of justice, and a woman's final, brilliant act of vengeance. Eleanor sat in a small, nondescript cafe, miles away from the marble halls, the black veils, and the suffocating weight of the Vance name. The morning light was gray, soft, and honest. She watched the steam rise from her coffee in lazy, swirling patterns, a simple, quiet ritual that belonged to no one but herself. She had lost her status. She had lost her family. She had lost the life she had spent 30 years meticulously constructing. She had traded a gilded cage for a simple, quiet existence. But as she looked down at her hands, she realized they were no longer trembling. The skin was steady. The grip was firm. She had paid the price for the truth, and for the first time in her life, she felt she could finally, truly breathe. The air was no longer heavy with the scent of lilies and lies, it was just air, clean and cold. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is let the world burn, just to see what's left in the ashes. Thank you for listening. I'll be back soon with another story that will keep you up at night. Until then, keep your secrets close, and your wills closer. The sound of a coffee cup being set down firmly on a saucer ended the morning.